All right, so pygmies. This is a pygmy, a small person, right? Sometimes they are called dwarves in the old text, but they are real. And we've all seen this map, the Mercator map that shows Hyperborea from 1595. It says here, showing the Arctic region and right the detailed from the Carta Marina by Magnus in the 1500s, depicting a European and pygmy fighting on Greenland. And if we zoom in here, we probably can't see it. I think it's the next picture. But up here, pygmies. All right, always on one of these land masses, we get pygmies. So what's the deal with pygmies? There used to be pygmies in Australia. I'm not sure if they're here anymore, but definitely my mother told me that she was taught about them in school, and it was kind of common knowledge back then that there were pygmies in Australia. Obviously, at the moment, we've only got West Africa. Okay, pygmies from Africa. These ones, this is Australian. These are two native Australians, and I'm guessing native pygmies. They're definitely not taught in school. I never learnt about it by the time I got to school, but apparently before that it was common knowledge that pygmies lived in Australia. Most of these photos are from Africa. Fighting the cranes, having a war. Now this is an old Greek relief, and this is a pygmy apparently. It's not rude, so get your mind out of the gutter. Breaking the neck of a crane, which apparently they were taught to do by humans. Here's another one on the side of a bowl. Pygmy about to club a crane. There's actually lots of these drawings. Apparently the pygmies used to ride goats into battle, and that when they battled the cranes, right? Here's some more. So let's go through a few of these. Here's another pygmy battling a crane. This dude looks more like a human. There is some of this narrative comes from Homer and the Iliad. I think it's the Iliad. It might be the Odyssey. More people fighting cranes, and cranes are basically storks. They're the same thing. Here's another one which looks kind of Greek. Another depiction, another goat riding a goat into battle. This one's a bit harder to see, but you can see there's people here and cranes here about to have a war. That one again. And here's some more pygmies. This time they're fighting a bear, but just to sort of show the depiction of pygmies, right? And they seem to have been wiped from the narrative. You know, I mean, they talk about them in Africa, you know, like in the Congo and places like that, but that's kind of it. Here's another one battling cranes. Here's a bigger shot. So these are Australian pygmies. Back, I'm guessing this is like the 50s or 60s. This is World War Zero, the forgotten conflict of the pygmies and the cranes. So this goes down, talks about war. This is all a bit later, but it shows all these depictions like 1493. These are where these pictures we just looked at came from. The 1400s, and then these are BC, the ones that look Greek. They're basically painted on vases and things. And it says Homer's Iliad, dated to 760 to 710 BC, one of the oldest extant works of Western literature, mentions the terrible war between the pygmy and the cranes, going so far as to compare the bloody battle of the Greeks and the Trojans with the ferocity of the ageless conflict between pygmy and crane. Quite interesting. So this little bit here, this talks about, I think this is talking about the, what did it say? The Greeks and the Trojans. Thus, by the leader's care, each martial band moves into ranks and stretches over the land, with the shouts of the Trojan rushing from afar, proclaiming their motions and provoking war. So this is just showing that Homer is basically you know, comparing the fighting of the Trojans and the Greeks to the Pygmies and the cranes. And down here, there's a few different verses. This is from Pliny the Elder, and he's talking about Pygmies. And Gerania stated to have been the abode of the race of Pygmies. Their name in the local dialect used to be Katitsi, and there is a belief that they were driven away by cranes. All right, this is around the Black Sea. And the story goes that basically they were in Hyperborea and they kept on getting attacked by the cranes. And so they would have to go to war every year with the cranes, and the cranes were winning. And, you know, Pygmies are smaller than, you know, these were big cranes, sort of 5-6 feet, the bigger, you know, so taller than the Pygmies. And it says that they would basically carry them away and eat them. And things like this, but having a big war, and in the end they drove them away from Hyperborea or something, you know, drove them south, and then they kept on getting driven further and further, ended up in Europe and Africa because the cranes were trying to eat them all. It says here there were some cranes who came to nibble at a field which a farmer had recently sown with wheat. The farmer began throwing rocks at the cranes, crippling a good many of them. The cranes abandoned the field. Let's run to the land of Pygmy. As the cranes abandoned, they cried, let's run to the land of Pygmy. That's from Aesop. So obviously cranes probably can't talk really, but it's just showing that this narrative was running around, you know, in the BC kind of times. It's an old narrative, and we have maps with Pygmies written up on there. And even Makeda showed that picture that we saw of the human fighting the Pygmy on Greenland, which is interesting. I'm just trying to find the bit where it says from Omar. So this is all about the Pygmies. I'll leave the link to this below. Among the people we call Pygmies, there was a girl born called Uno. I think it's Uno, who was a flawless beauty, but she was graceless by nature and overweening. She cared not a rap for Artemis and Hera. She was married to one of the citizens, a good and sensible man, and gave birth to a child. And all Pygmy, who loved to show kindliness, brought her many gifts to celebrate the birth of the child. So this is just showing that Pygmies seem to be everywhere at one point, right? Like maybe a different race that lived alongside of us. The cranes do this, for they travel from Scythia to the marshes in the higher parts of Egypt, from which the Nile originates. This is the place where the Pygmies dwell, and this is no fable, and there is really, as it is said, a race of dwarfs, both men and horses, which lead the life of troglodytes, which is just a cave dweller, means to live in a cave. And that's from Aristotle. So many of these, you know, Greek names that we've heard, the Greek wise men have written about Pygmies. Despite the Pygmy exodus from their original Scythian abode, the conflict between Pygmy and crane appears to have taken on a global character. Arab scholars of the 14th century AD, Italian missionary and explorer Friar Odric, agree upon tales told in China about remnant populations of Pygmy, struggling to survive against the continued predations of angry cranes in the Himalayas. Chinese annals record similar accounts. The 5th century Chinese religious text, the Shenai King, states that in the region of the Sihai is the land of the cranes, where men and women are only 7 inches tall. That's fairly short. The only creatures they fear are cranes, which come here from the sea. The cranes, which in one single flight travel 1,000 miles, can gobble them up. So that's from China. This is, what's that, 1930? That one's a bit older. Pliny the Elder locates a remaining population of Pygmies somewhere between Egypt and Ethiopia, but notes the ongoing conflict with the cranes, emphasizing the desperate and morally questionable Pygmy strategy of getting to the cranes' eggs before they could hatch another generation of winged super soldiers. So that's apparently one of the defenses, is that Pygmies would go out and try and steal the eggs to, you know, obviously stop more of them being born. Aristotle says pygmies live in caves, but in the rest of this statement about he agrees via other authorities. And up here it says, it's reported that in springtime their entire band, mounted on the back of rams and she-goats and armed with arrows, goes in a body down to the sea and eats the cranes' eggs and chickens. And that this outing occupies 3 months. So is that why they started the war? I don't know. Was that a defense? Who knows? But the point is that there's pygmies. You know, there are other races of people, or at least there have been in the recent past, that we're not told about. And we see these depictions on maps, in drawings, it's written down. Yet they're again trying to wipe this from our past, from our history. The Cherokees, for example, who have ancestral home was in the southeast of the USA, have a legend which tells of a journey by some young men of the tribe who wished to see the world. They travelled south until they came upon a tribe of very little people, the Sundijiwi, who had strangely shaped bodies and barely reached up to a man's knees. These little men lived in nests in the sand that were covered with dry grass, and that they were terrified of wild geese that came in great flocks from the south and attacked them. When the Cherokees arrived, the Sundijiwi were in a state of great anxiety because the wind was blown from the south, bringing with it some white feathers, and this was a sure sign that the birds were not far away. The Cherokee asked, why did they not defend themselves against the birds? But the dwarves said they had no weapons. The Cherokees did not have time to make bows and arrows for them, but they did show them how to use sticks and clubs so that they could hit the birds on their necks and kill them. And that's, by the way, what we saw in those depictions. Every time they're fighting the cranes, they're hitting them in the necks. All right. So that's interesting. So there's a few more. This is basically just showing all the different accounts of where they've been mentioned. The Pygmies, the Great Pygmy War. This is Pygmies versus beasts, according to Homer and Pliny. According to Homer, there existed a tribe of Pygmies, or diminutive people 1.5 feet tall, who were constantly at war with cranes, and that's in the Iliad, Book 3. This Greek myth recounts how these Pygmies lived in caves and rode about on rams. Annually, the tribe partook in a great war with the cranes, with the object to steal and eat many crane eggs and chicks, thereby keeping the vicious crane population in check. So we have these threads running through, right? That the Pygmies lived in caves, that they were riding goats, she-goats, rams, and that they were fighting cranes. So I find that very interesting because there's many more than just one account here. There's an engraving. This is this one, the Flemish engraving. I don't know if we can get that any bigger. Let's have a look. Oh, there we go. So as you can see, this is the big war between Pygmies riding goats. So I can zoom in a bit. As you can see, this is a goat. There's a little people, and they're fighting cranes or storks. Same thing. So it's normally Pygmies and cranes, but it could be Pygmies and storks, or dwarves and storks. So I just, how do I get out of that? I don't know. Let's see. Can I go backwards? Yes. I hope. So that was depicted or drawn by Flemish artist Adriaan Colliert in the 1500s. And there's more down here. So there's this one. Oh, that's not a good place to be. Jeez, mate, you better be careful. Don't be there at toilet time. But I guess this is showing small people, right? Pygmies. Don't know why they're eating elephants. But there are many things in this world, right? In Book 8 of Pliny the Elder's Natural History, we read that the caveman on the frontier of Ethiopia, whose only food is elephant meat obtained by hunting, climb up trees near the elephant's track, blah, blah, blah. A quote which is very apt to illustrate the engraving, with the exception that the Ethiopians seem to have been depicted as pygmies. So just more references about pygmies. And then I think this is the one. Yeah, so this is actually Wikipedia. I couldn't find the verse I was looking for. And is it down here? Hesidius. Ovid describes the origin of the age-old battle, speaking of a pygmy queen named Jarana who offended the goddess Hera with her boast of superior beauty and was transformed into a crane. Okay, and then obviously came back and started eating people. And here it says the pygmies were often portrayed as pudgy, comical dwarves, which is interesting. So the pygmies, these dwarves, because dwarves, right? They live in, they're miners, right? What you mine in caves. It says the pygmies lived in caves. So are these the same people that we're talking about here? Whoops. St. Augustine in the 300s mentioned the pigs in the city of God. Book 16, Chapter 8, entitled Whether Certain Monstrous Races of Men Are Derived from the Stock of Adam or Noah. So he's saying there's a different race of men, and they were pygmies. In another legend, the pygmies once encountered Heracles, and climbing all over the sleeping hero, attempted to bind him down, but when he stood up, they fell off. The story was adapted by Jonathan Swift as a template for Lilliputians. Sounds like Gulliver's Travels as well, right? That happens in Gulliver's Travels. So it's interesting. Was Gulliver a giant, or was he normal and all the other people small? Was he going through the land of the pygmies? Later Greek geographers and writers attempted to place the pygmies in a geographical context, sometimes saying they were located in far India and other times near the Ethiopians of Africa. The pygmy bush tribes of Central Africa were so named after the Greek mythological creatures by European explorers. So they're calling them mythological creatures here, but then they say there's bush tribes of them and show you pictures. That's interesting. Greeks used the proverbial phrase, fitting pygmies' spoils onto a colossus, in reference to those toiling in vain, to those bringing together incomparable things, and especially when they were compared tiny things to huge ones. So there you go, a bit about the pygmy crane war. But basically, they started up in Hyperborea. It's, we can see on the maps, and it looks like they were pushed out, and then they were constantly everywhere they settled, they were being harassed and set upon by these cranes or storks. And another type, that we see is the stork, right? The stork carrying the baby. Did that come from a crane carrying a small human or a pygmy? All right, stories about babies being delivered by storks or growing in cabbage patches have been enchanting people for generations. And down here it says, where is it? The myth of the baby carrying the stork carrying the baby can be traced back to ancient Greece, where cranes, which share many similarities with storks, were associated with stealing babies. In Greek mythology, Hera, the goddess of childbirth, turned her rival Jarana into a crane with an elongated neck because she was having an affair with her husband Zeus. Unwilling to part with her newborn child, Jarana picked up the baby, wrapped it in a blanket, and flew off with the infant in her beak. So that's the story from Greece. But as we saw before, a lot of the stories of the pygmies also come from Greece. So is that like an adapted story? Over time, the crane was conflated with the stork, says Paul Quinn. There's a link with domesticity because storks nest on people's roofs. So he's trying to explain it, basically by what he can see with ignoring the old stories. But I mean, what do you think? That's an interesting side note, isn't it? Oh, it's the same one. Of storks carrying, are they babies or are they pygmies, small humans? What do you think? So these are called shoebill storks. And these pretty prehistoric looking things, a bit mean, but they're pretty big. This looks like a small one. So they live up to 35 years, size 3.5 to 4.5 feet. So basically 1.4 meters, and they weigh around 5. Well, that's not too much. 5.5 kilos. But this is them. Pretty interesting birds, shoebill storks, and apparently you've got to bow to them when you walk up to them. Look at that one. That's a real. When you walk up to them, you have to bow, and they bow back. Look at the big thing on the end of its beak. All right, it's coming to get you. So these things are a bit crazy. So this is, a zookeeper, and he's bowing to this shoebill stork. So he bows down, and look, the stork bows down to him. So there you go. You've got to bow to these spoonbills. There we go. Doing a little dance for us. And this is real, right? It's not fake. But it looks kind of fake, doesn't it? The shoebill stork. Let's see, will she bow to it? Oh, he's saying bow, 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 bow to me, human. She's trying to bow, but it's not taking it. So there you go.